탄수화물 섭취를 제한하는 키토제닉 식단은 근육을 만드는데 유리할까요? 대부분의 보디빌딩 선수들은 탄수화물 섭취를 단백질만큼이나 중요하게 생각합니다. 그래서 카니보어, 키토제닉 같은 저탄수화물 식단을 체중 감량 목적으로 시작하는 사람은 많지만 근육증가를 목적으로 활용하는 경우는 드뭅니다. 하지만 20년 넘게 엄격한 카니보어 식단을 해온 앤소니 채피 박사의 몸을 한번 봅시다.
I get about 70-80% of my calories from fat. And I'm not fat. Fat doesn't make you fat. Fat makes you lean, strong, and healthy.
오늘 영상의 주인공 숀 베이커 박사 역시 8년 동안 탄수화물을 거의 먹지 않고 모든 영양소를 동물성 식품을 통해 섭취했음에도 57세의 나이에 놀라운 몸과 운동 퍼포먼스를 보여주고 있습니다. 그는 탄수화물과 근육의 관계에 대해 어떻게 생각할까요?
One of the things I've heard a number of people say is that you cannot build muscle without carbohydrates, or carbohydrates are the optimal way to build muscle. And I think there's some caveats about that. Now, I've been on this carnivore diet now, this is my 8th year. And when I started, I was around 245. I'm now about 265. I am now much stronger than I was at, 7-8 years ago when I was 49, 50. Today at 57. I've done this without taking, steroids and testosterone, as many people have sort of accused me of that, but I definitely have not done that. But I've been able to certainly add some muscle and some strength while being on a carnivore diet. I've added some body fat as well. I mean, that's undeniable. I would say probably in those 8 years, I've managed to put on about 10 pounds of muscle, which may not seem like that much. It's a little more than a pound a year, but at my age, it's actually reasonably well. I've been lifting weights for 45 years now, so it's not like these aren't newbie gains that you might obtain in the early years. And so the literature is quite clear when it comes to muscle protein synthesis. That's how you synthesize and build muscle, that carbohydrates do not provide any additional muscle protein synthesis as stimulated by insulin. And because people talk about you need carbs to stimulate insulin, well, it's well known that protein alone gives you as much stimulus for insulin that you need, and adding carbohydrates does not add to that in any way, shape, or form. Now, there may be some benefits on the other side of the equation. Remember, net protein or net muscle building is relying upon muscle protein synthesis, less muscle protein breakdown, and that what you have left is the net. And some people will argue that carbohydrates can limit muscle protein breakdown. And why are we breaking down muscles? Well, in some sense, it's a protein reservoir. Some of that may go into the energy supply, right? And so it goes into the energy supply. And the other thought is that carbohydrates will help you fuel your workouts better so that you can train harder and get a better result. And again, there's some truth to that. However, again, I think it is situational. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that carbohydrates can fuel glycogen and also help with blood glucose increasing blood glucose to a degree. What we see is that those athletes that are adapted to that fueling strategy do better with that fueling strategy. That is to say, if you're used to training, predominantly utilizing glucose, then you're going to do better with carbohydrates. There's no doubt about that. But what happens to someone who is chronically adapted to a lower carb diet, a ketogenic diet for not just a few weeks, but months and months and perhaps years and years? Well, then the energy, is dependent upon, other energy sources, particularly fat. You can train very intensely, as guys like Phil Prims and others have demonstrated, very intensely with a primarily fat-fueled diet. You're still going to have some glucose. Your glucose never goes to zero. Your hepatic glycogen reserves will still be reasonably topped off. You can still produce for those high levels. Certainly for the effort that's required for muscle building. Now,
1년에 0.5kg의 근육량 증가가 많은 분들에게는 크게 와닿지 않으실 거예요. 왜냐하면 진지하게 근력 운동을 해보신 분들은 몇 달만 열심히 해도 2-3kg의 근육량이 증가하는 걸 경험해 보셨을 테니까요. 하지만 그런 가파른 성장은 운동을 처음 시작하는 초기에만 가능합니다. 저는 늘 근육량 증가를 목적으로 운동을 하진 않았지만 20년 가까이 웨이트 트레이닝을 해왔습니다. 돌이켜보면 저의 순수한 근육량은 운동을 시작한 초기 2년 동안 대부분 만들어졌던 것 같습니다. 숀 베이커 박사의 경우 수십 년간 고강도 트레이닝으로 신체가 최정점에 도달한 상태이고 57세라는 나이까지 고려하면 그의 성장은 엄청난 성과를 할 수 있겠습니다.
If we're talking about marathons and multiple WODs on CrossFit or something like that, that's a different story. But just to build muscle, the main ingredients are going to be, number one, training. Training is the absolute most important aspect of it. You've got to put in the consistent work and the training. The other thing beyond that is you've got to have adequate protein, and then beyond that is adequate energy supply, you know? And so if you're breaking down muscle, we talk about muscle protein synthesis versus muscle protein breakdown, if you're breaking down some of that muscle and some of that goes into the energy supply to produce, say, glucose, you know, we have gluconeogenic amino acids. We also have some ketogenic amino acids, but if you're breaking it down and carbohydrates inhibit that a little because you have plenty of energy, well, what happens if you're used to using ketones for energy? You know, then you supply plenty of ketones and free fatty acids, then you're going to have less breakdown as well. At least that's theoretical, I would suppose. But practically, you know, I've been able to put on muscle. I know a lot of people have been able to put on muscle. Now, again, we see a lot of people pointing to guys who are taking steroids. That's a completely different it's a completely different conversation here. You know, I don't take steroids. You know, I'm carrying around 270 pounds of mass right now, 265, 270 depending on when I last eat. That is a lot of muscle mass for particularly someone who's not on drugs. You know, and so those people that are out there pointing to, you know, bodybuilder X, Y, or Z, almost all of them are on drugs, and so that's a completely different story. You know, I speculate if I got on drugs, I'd be a lot bigger than I am now. I have no desire to do that. 270 is plenty. It's plenty big, believe me. And I will probably, once I achieve the rowing goals I'm trying to achieve, I will probably, you know, lean back down into the 250s, I would imagine. Hopefully retaining, you know, at least a decent amount of the muscle that I've managed to gain over the last several years. All right, guys. So yes, you can gain muscle on a carnivore diet. You got to eat though. I mean, you got to push yourself at the table. You got to push yourself in the gym. You might have to eat more than you want to eat, and that is, again, one of the benefits of carbohydrates is it's easier to consume more calories with carbohydrates. There's no doubt about it. That's why a lot of athletes choose it, because they can just eat more. They can get into a caloric surplus a little easier. Like I'd mentioned, if you are adapted to training with glucose and carbohydrates, then yes, it's going to benefit you in that way. But again, if you're chronically adapted to utilizing more of a fat-based diet, you know, as long as you provide your body that energy, you're going to have less muscle protein breakdown. However, that adaptation period can take 3 months, 6 months, a year perhaps for some people.
탄수화물 없이도 충분한 근육 증가가 가능하다는 것이 숀 베이커 박사가 내린 결론입니다. 그는 이론만을 앞세워 설명하는 의사가 아닙니다. 스스로의 몸과 행동으로 그것을 증명하고 있습니다. 그러나 여기서 여러분이 반드시 기억해야 할 점은 우리 몸이 지방대상 모드로 전환하는 데는 충분한 시간이 필요하다는 것입니다. 이 시기에 생기기 쉬운 근손실을 방지하기 위해 반드시 선행돼야 하는 것은 운동입니다. 숀 베이커 박사도 근육을 키우기 위해 훈련이 절대적으로 중요하다고 말했습니다. 탄수화물 양을 줄이면 에너지가 부족한 느낌이 들 수 있지만 평소에 하던 운동 강도를 유지하기 위해 노력해야 합니다. 두 번째로 중요한 것은 식단입니다. 식단을 구성하는데 서툰 초기에는 탄수화물 없이 충분한 칼로리를 섭취하기가 생각보다 쉽지 않습니다. 그래서 만약 저탄수화물 식단을 하기로 결정했고 근육량을 유지하거나 늘리고 싶다면 지방과 단백질을 과감하게 많이 섭취해도 됩니다. 저는 식단을 짤 때 단백질 양을 먼저 체크합니다. 그리고 식재료를 고지방 식품으로 선택하면 자연스럽게 적절한 식사량이 맞춰집니다. 예를 들어 제 체중은 76kg이고 150g의 단백질을 섭취하고 싶습니다. 이를 위해서 부위에 따라 차이는 있겠지만 소고기 700g 정도를 섭취해야 합니다. 그리고 이때는 지방이 많은 등심 같은 부위를 선택하고 만약 지방이 적은 고기를 먹을 때는 버터를 더 넣어서 지방량을 맞춥니다. 이렇게 하면 지방과 단백질을 대략 2대1의 비율로 충분히 섭취할 수 있습니다. 먹을 때마다 귀찮아서 어떻게 이렇게 하냐고 생각하실 수도 있습니다. 하지만 말씀드린 대로 저탄수화물 식단을 시작하는 초기에는 탄수화물 없는 식사가 익숙하지 않기 때문에 전체적인 식사량이 많이 줄어들 수 있고 이는 운동하는 사람이 가장 두려워하는 근손실을 유발합니다. 이 식단에 적응하게 되면 일일이 계산하지 않고 포만감 신호에 따라서 충분히 배가 부를 때까지 드시면 됩니다. 하지만 익숙하지 않은 시기에는 제가 제시하는 방법이 도움이 될 수 있으니 참고하시기 바랍니다. 그럼 저탄수화물 식단으로 근육을 증가시키기 위한 구체적인 방법론에 대해서 숀 베이커 박사의 이야기를 더 들어보겠습니다.
All right, one of the things I'm often asked about is how do I put on muscle on a carnivore diet? Now, I am, been doing this diet now for things like that. And so what might you consider when you are trying to put on muscle mass? Like obviously, it's pretty easy to figure out how to gain fat. That's pretty easy for most people. But gaining muscle is a different sort of animal altogether, so to speak. And some of it's quite honestly not normal physiology. It's not, if you look at hunter-gatherers or probably ancient populations, they weren't a lot of just big, overly muscled people. So it's hard to put on muscle beyond a certain point. And I think when we look at what does the science of muscle building tell us, it seems to be that hypertrophy as opposed to strength, and you train for those a little bit differently. Hypertrophy really responds a little bit more to volume, right? So volume-based training, you know, something like 10 to 12 sets per body part per week at a adequate intensity consistently held over time. And what does adequate intensity mean? It means basically approaching failure. You know, you're doing bench presses and you can only do 10 reps, and so you need to do at least 9, maybe 10 reps. And you do that, you know, 10, 12 times a week, you're gonna get enough volume for your chest, so to speak. Now, if you're an advanced trainer, you might need even more volume than that. So it's interesting to see. That's what the literature seems to indicate. Now, I know there's people that are into the HIIT training and doing 1 set per week, but again, it's what the literature seems to show as far as volume-based training in most bodybuilders. And again, I don't think necessarily bodybuilding is the end-all, be-all to what everybody should do. I think there's probably maybe more healthy things to do when it comes to function and quality of life and so on and so forth. But putting on muscle in general, hypertrophy in general is going to require probably higher volume over a period of time. So if you need to do 12 sets a week, maybe you do 6 sets twice a day, or, you know, 4 sets 3 times a week or something like that.
운동 경력이 있으신 분들은 숀 베이커 박사가 제시한 운동 볼륨이나 세트 수에 대해 여러 의견을 제시할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 세트 수는 운동 레벨에 따라서 큰 폭으로 달라질 수 있고, 일반적인 관점에서 제시한 방법론이라는 점을 감안해서 봐주시기 바랍니다. 그것보다 중요한 것은 실패 지점에 근접해야 한다는 것입니다. 근비대라는 것은 자연적이고 정상적인 생리기전이 아니기 때문에 우리 몸에 충분한 과부하를 주어야만 합니다. 적당한 무게로 적당히 하고 내려놓는 운동도 건강상의 이점은 있겠지만 근비대를 목적으로 하는 운동으로는 적합하지 않습니다.
And then let's talk about the nutrition side of it. Now, again, what is driving anabolism, the sort of capacity to store and build things, you know, glycogen storage, fat storage, muscle building. Insulin has a big role in that, right? And so when we're talking about the context of, say, a carnivore diet, you've got 2 macronutrients, basically. You've got fat and you've got protein. And fat has minimal impact on insulin. In fact, some people would suggest there's no impact in human studies of insulin by fat. Some type 1 diabetics might say they don't seem to think that is true. But the direct effect of fat on insulin seems to be negligible, right? So the only other macronutrient you have to deal with is protein. Now, protein certainly can provide an insulin stimulus. And we know when it comes to muscle building, protein provides adequate insulin signaling. And beyond that, with carbohydrates, has no additional bearing. There's a number of studies that support that. So you basically have to consume probably more protein than you currently are if you're not gaining weight. And you probably have to consume more overall energy and calories, more than you currently are. The best strategy for that, in my view, I've found, is that meal frequency, increasing meal frequency. So many people on a carnivore diet find themselves kind of 2 meals a day. That's kind of a natural rhythm to fall into. It seems to sync with our appetites pretty well, and that works pretty well. That's what I do 90% of the time. Now, I'm currently in a weight loss phase, which is kind of, I'm doing some of the opposite things. But I mean, for muscle building, more frequent meals, that's going to be partially very beneficial, and we know that 2 meals a day is better than 1 meal a day when it comes to triggering muscle protein synthesis. 3 meals is slightly better than 2 meals, and 4 meals is even slightly less better than or slightly more better than 3 meals. And again, there's a diminishing turn. Basically, 1 and 2 meals are the most important, and then beyond that is where you get these small incremental improvements. And so, how do you do that? Well, you know, you're probably going to have to, you know, obviously reduce the overall size of the meal, but increase them in frequency so that the overall volume of food is higher. You know, you might go from say 150 grams of protein up to 200 grams of protein or something along those lines. Remember, protein is insulinogenic, and so we want to stimulate insulin because it's going to help us to store this thing. We don't have to be in a huge caloric excess. I mean, you don't need to be consuming an extra 2,000 calories a day in many cases. And there's a period of time where you're going to adapt, and so it's really just a long, slow game, particularly when you're doing it without drugs. And I think that's, in my view, the best way to do it. You know, it's just a steady grind process. It's not going to be easy. You got to put the work in. It's hard. It sucks. I mean, I struggle every day. I mean, I train hard. I work hard. It's not sometimes pleasant, but is it worth it in the end? I mean, that's up to you to decide. If you really want to put on muscle, That's what you got to do, guys. All right. There's no secret shortcuts. I mean, I guess there are. You can take steroids and that sort of stuff, but I'm not an advocate for that. And so there you go. Eat more protein, eat more frequently, train adequate volume with adequate intensity. And over time, might take you a year, might take you 2 years, you will put on muscle. Like I said, in 8 years, I've managed to put on 10 pounds of muscle. You know, that's a little bit more than a pound a year, which doesn't seem like much, but it adds up over time. You know, I mean, if I was brand new to training, I never lifted weights before, I could expect to gain 10, 12, 15, even 20 pounds in a year. But once you're kind of seasoned and you've been doing it for a long time, you start getting close to your genetic potential, it's really tough. But again, putting in the work, it's worth it. All right, guys, let me know what you think. What's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? Talk to me about things. Oh, the other thing I didn't mention was, protein powders and things like that. Are they carnivore? No, they're not carnivore, technically. I mean, I know there's beef isolates and whey proteins, which are carnivore ingredients, but I mean, that sort of isn't really the point. And the point is to eat whole foods. Could you add protein powder in there if you could not get your protein from other sources? Yes, you could. Should you? I don't know. I mean, it's one, there's problems with GI upset for some people. Again, if you're dealing with some issue, some health-related issue, that's probably diabetes. Diabetes, certainly protein powder is more likely to spike your blood glucose, just because of the rapid onset of absorption that it often has. If you have some sort of GI-related autoimmune issue where, leaky gut, inflamed gut leads to downstream symptoms, and then maybe this might not be the best strategy for you. Absent those things, could you use a protein powder? You could. Again, great source of protein, there's no doubt about it. Very bioavailable, very well absorbed. However, what are you missing out on the protein powders? You're missing out on essential fatty acids and things like that. So there's pros and cons of that. I generally get plenty of protein from the food I eat, and I think that's what you should do primarily. And if you can't do that for some weird reason, try to adjust things so that you can, and last resort, you can add these things like whey protein. Whey protein is probably the most effective out there. Clearly, there's pretty good evidence behind that. Some of the beef isolates probably are reasonable as well, although, I think whey protein is probably still a better source for those that tolerate dairy. Let me know what you guys think. You guys take care. Bye-bye.
만약 음식만으로 충분한 영양을 섭취할 수 있는 사람은 단백질 보충제를 굳이 먹지 않아도 됩니다. 하지만 필요한 사람도 있고 경우에 따라서는 유용한 도구로 활용될 수도 있습니다. 저는 1일 1식을 할 경우 필요한 단백질을 채우기가 어려워서 종종 단백질 보충제를 섭취합니다. 저희 채널에서는 간헐적 단식의 이점을 강조해왔기 때문에 다소 혼란스러우실 수도 있을 것 같습니다. 하지만 이 영상의 주제는 근성장이기 때문에 이러한 방법을 제시한 것이지 모든 사람들에게 자주 먹는 것을 권장하는 것은 아닙니다. 식단이라는 것은 항상 똑같은 정답이 존재하지 않습니다. 우리는 각자 다른 목적을 가지고 있고 그 목적에 따라서 다른 방식을 취할 수도 있습니다. 이상한 다이어트였습니다.